Hello, Jerry here. Welcome back to the Old Testament book of Esther, chapter 3. We've seen chapter 1, Queen Vashti out. We wish her well. And chapter 2, Queen Esther in. Esther the Jewess was an orphan parented by her older cousin Mordecai. And Mordecai insisted they keep their Jewish ethnicity a secret. As exiles, there are always those who will treat you as less. Everything seemed to be going okay, until young Esther, in her late teens or early 20s, was pulled into a new harem for King Xerxes, a great crisis. Mordecai, when not working, was pacing outside her building, hoping for news. God or prayer, these words are not mentioned in this book, but in all that pacing by Mordecai, do you think Mordecai might have squeaked out a prayer or two? Yes, probably so. Can't prove it, but what we don't need to prove is how God regularly is working to build our faith, and certainly through trials. He loves us so much that He is regularly nudging us to Himself, where we are the most joyful and fulfilled in Him. The women in this new harem learned that the king hoped to replace Queen Vashti from this group. Whatever young Esther was thinking, she no doubt was very encouraged to see how regularly she was receiving favor from those around her, very much like young Daniel had in Babylon a little over a century earlier. He was about her age, a story she would know, and perhaps Daniel was an encouragement to her. Even the king favored her, and she was installed as the new queen. Mordecai also learned about an assassination plot against the king and divulged the plot to Esther, and Esther revealed this to the king in Mordecai's name, followed by the two traitors' execution. Now we enter chapter 3, where it was Mordecai's turn to suffer a great trial. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Haman loved to get the homage of everybody every day as he paraded himself around. However, Mordecai would not give homage to Haman, even though bowing and showing respect to Persian leaders was just part of their culture and would have been done by the Jews regularly, including Mordecai. But in this case, Haman was an exception to Mordecai, probably for the following reasons. First, I think Mordecai saw through Haman that he was not an honorable person, worthy of any kind of respect. As we will see fleshed out in the book, Haman was a very low person, an extreme narcissist, craving the worship of others. Like snow in summer or rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. Like one who binds the stone in the sling is one who gives honor to a fool. It may also have been that Haman was pushing the homage too far. There's no homage police around regulating the leadership style of Haman. The Moody Bible Commentary points out, of course Jews were permitted to bow down to other people out of simple respect, but they were forbidden to worship more than one God. The Hebrew verbs here translated bow down and paid homage, when used together, are attested only in the sense of worship. End quote. So not only did the low character of Haman probably irk Mordecai, but Mordecai would not fall into the worshipful homage that Haman solicited. Mordecai took his stand based upon his Jewish faith, which is what verse 4 said. Mordecai went against his own policy and now revealed his Jewish identity as the reason for his stand against Haman. This trial brought that out from him. I think this was all spiritual preparatory work for what God was going to do, and how God was stirring up Mordecai's faith. Though I should mention that some Bible scholars would disagree with me here. They don't view Mordecai and Esther in very positive ways. They believe their timidity against mentioning God in the book was an expression of their lack of faith. And they say Esther can't be at all spiritual because she was in a harem and she married a Gentile king. And we don't hear about her insisting upon a kosher diet like Daniel did earlier. For instance, one solid evangelical commentary I like was often not very friendly to Mordecai and Esther. The commentator characterized Esther as shallow, superficial, and selfish in chapter 4, and after a discussion about Mordecai's stand against Haman, the commentator concludes, quote, "Even if the reader understands why Mordecai does not bow, it is difficult to admire him for it." End quote. The commentator is more comfortable with this being a personal flaw in Mordecai. Now, I understand that we have to guard against sensationalizing biblical characters, but I do admire Mordecai for this. I see that God was awakening his faith and the faith of Esther. He was meeting them where they were and growing them into something very special. So, just to let you know, there is the pretty common view that the book of Esther shows how God can work out his sovereign plan even through secular-minded Jews like Mordecai and Esther, with whom the Lord was not even in their vocabulary. Those of this view believe they did their actions for their own non-spiritual reasons, but look and see what God was able to do despite them and using their very actions. And perhaps that's what it is. I would agree that God can and does do this, but I personally see the book of Esther as more typical with how God so often works with his people through the whole Bible, that his people he uses are also people the Lord has fully engaged in the journey. Mordecai and Esther did not have to wait for the book of Esther to come out to realize all that God had done, but that they were fully involved as co-laborers in what God was doing. Not that they always instantly understood everything, but by the end they could piece it together. Which, by the way, is the better way to journey through life, don't you think? Reflecting on what God is doing. Many of you all have traveled to various countries. When my daughter and I made our way around Western Europe by planes and mostly trains, it was obvious who was who. The locals, using the trains regularly, were enduring the journey. The visitors like us were actively looking out the windows, interacting with the scenery. It was all exciting. And that's how we want to journey through life, isn't it? Paying attention to God's creation, his word, and what he is doing in and around us. God made us to engage with the life he gives us, because we really are tourists, sojourners in this world. We love that the Mordecai and Esther we meet at the beginning of the story are not the same at the end, when they were spiritually prepared for their more significant roles in the government that we'll see later. I think it was the Lord who brought Esther into the harem, not her unwise, shallow choice, and that it was the Lord using evil Haman to bring Mordecai out of his cloistered, safe existence to a person who proudly announced he was a Jew and took his stand against worshipful bows to Haman. Even though Esther was the most cherished and important person in Mordecai's life, He was willing to perish from this earth on this issue and no longer be there for Esther. And Mordecai refused to bow not just once, but day after day as Haman strutted through the citadel. That's what the text said. Each day he was ready to die for his Jewish conviction. So I'm inspired by his courageous stand, and I hope you are also. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, that is, that he was Jewish, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Haman didn't notice until someone finked on Mordecai. Rather than quickly seek the execution of Mordecai, Haman schemed of genocide to the whole Jewish nation, because Mordecai had communicated he could not bow like this to Haman because he was Jewish. And this was extra delicious because Mordecai would live until this annihilation of the Jewish people, all because of Mordecai's stubborn refusal against Haman. The ultimate revenge, the death of not just Mordecai's physical body, but a crushing guilty weight to his soul for being that person responsible. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So Haman the narcissist was also a worshipper of the gods, like most everyone. So he paid attention to omens and signs. His servants cast lots to determine when was the most propitious time to destroy the Jewish nation. And the lots pointed to a distant month, 11 months later. Proverbs notes, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." God worked in this, and we'll see how the Lord uses this time. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." Well, lots of misleading untruths here. Haman didn't even specify the ethnic group he was referring to, probably because with Xerxes he didn't need to. The Jews kept the Persian laws and were profitable. The Jews occupied many jobs, like Mordecai. The Murashu tablets, discovered in 1893, contain at least 70 Jewish names of those Jews working in one particular area of Persia then. They were not societal leeches. Haman's words pointed to the Jews as a threat to the nation's security and welfare. "If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Okay, so Haman offered to pay the equivalent of millions of dollars to fund this purging within the kingdom. However, the king's response is hard for us to understand. The NIV translates this, "keep the money," making an interpretive decision for us. Literally, it says in Hebrew, "the money," or "the silver is given to you." And so the ESV translates to leave the decision to the reader, saying, "the money is given to you." Haman would have understood the nuance. But here we are, thousands of years later, trying to decide, was the king refusing Haman's money and saying, "I'll pay"? Or was he affirming, "Yes, take your money and do this"? Now, in light of two later verses, I think it's best to understand that the king accepted the money and was saying, you can use the money for this. And also after the wars with Greece and this long feast, he probably needs the money. In Esther 4:7, Mordecai says, Mordecai told him all that happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. So that's the first verse that seems to point to Haman's money being accepted. As well, later in the book, we'll run into a pretty clear verse about Haman's money being behind the plot. And I'll save that verse for later. How did Haman have so much money? Well, maybe he was already from a wealthy family. Or maybe he made a lot of money on the side through corruption. Or was he counting on confiscating all Jewish property and a lot of their goods to fund this? Another plausible answer is noted by the NIV Cultural Background Study Bible. I really like study Bibles. Another possibility is that Haman's position gave him authority over certain public monies, and Xerxes granted him permission to use those funds for the task. End quote. So, when Haman said, I'll pay this much money into the royal treasury, it was understood that he meant from the vast public monies he managed. That is, if this view is correct. The most striking thing about this pitch by Haman to Xerxes is that the king gave his approval without even possessing enough curiosity as to ask what group was being destroyed. And by the way, this destruction would have included even those Jews who had returned to Jerusalem and Judah because they were still under the Persian rule and in the empire. It was the whole nation of Jews at risk. Haman knew exactly who he was talking to and how to play Xerxes. Xerxes' leadership style is called laissez-faire leadership, from the French meaning to just let go. That is, to let things happen as they will. Laissez-faire leaders avoid leadership. They express non-leadership. They are extremely passive to the will of others and to the flow of circumstances. In Xerxes' case, it was allowing his advisors to dictate policies and actions, and now letting Haman take the whole leadership charge of this important campaign. Haman, in contrast, was diligent in his devious work here, making all the scheme completely legal and setting this into motion according to unchangeable laws. Now, to be kind to Xerxes, I think we could say he was in the wrong place in life, which brought out the very worst of him. At some other particular trade, maybe he would have been fine. Louis XVI of France would love to have been a simple clockmaker, but instead, he inherited kingship at the age of 19, along with the French Revolution and the guillotine. It's very sad, because he was a very hard-working, honest, and God-fearing person, just not in a place that really fit him. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples. To every province in its own script and every people in its own language, it was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So the decree went out all over the empire. And then that amazing statement, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. Wow. How to find words to respond to that. And there was confusion in the capital. Why would all these hardworking Jews who were there and in all the other provinces be wiped out and plundered on a certain day? Well, yes, there were enough people who would do this for plunder's sake and because they didn't like the Jews, but the empire was not a hotbed of anti-Semitism. The Jews occupied important working roles in the economy. And that's a scary precedent. What other group will be next? Next week, chapter 4, Lord willing, the response of God's people still in exile to this threat of genocide. But let's first preview the first verse as a teaser. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. Exactly what Haman wished so much for, the inner agony of the man who refused to bow to him. Thanks very much.